Jesus Christ.
I don't know if you noticed it this year, but Christmas lights sure went up early, didn't they? How many people saw them in September? I saw a couple in September pop up. October, lots in October. Ours went up a little bit. I don't know. I think I was ready right after Halloween to get them up. You know, people, we're just looking, I think, for a little bit of light and joy in the midst of this dismal year. And now we hear on the radio, it's the most wonderful time of the year. Whoever wrote that did not create that during a pandemic. You know, as truth be told, as 2020 careens to its end, we simply want to get through this month, don't we, and get out of this year, and hopefully we'll have a vaccine. As we entered Advent last year, could we even imagine what we were heading into? You know, maybe some of you had your job evaluation last fall, and your boss got to the point, it's like, okay, so what are your goals for next year? It's like, well, I want to build a room in my house to hoard toilet paper, and I'm thinking of learning how to create my own sanitizer. And I want to start a new vocabulary with words like comorbidity, congregate setting, and PPE. I want to get that tattooed on my wrist. This has been a rough year. You know, the global pandemic, we've had massive wildfires, racial tension, a tough election, probably 100 other things. Every one of us is suffering the stress of this time. We are all experiencing deep loss. Every single one of us. Our jobs have been affected. Some of us have lost them. Our businesses have been crushed by the economic situation. Thanksgiving dinners were a challenge and sometimes held over Zoom. Many of our elderly have died alone, surrounded by not their family, but by health professionals covered in PPE protection. Graduations, summer camps, vacations, all of them have been canceled. And many of our kids at those prime times in their educational life and experience are sitting there looking through a pane of glass, staring at a webcam. FaceTime and Zoom have replaced hugs and handshakes for many of us. More than any other Christmas in recent memory, more than any other Advent in recent memory, this one means, in some ways, the challenge of how do we get through the loneliness and the hardship and the pain of this year. I think there's 3 takeaways from our readings today about how we can be an Advent people even in the midst of a year like this. The first takeaway, here comes the King. Here comes the King, here comes a big number one. Anybody remember that jingle? No? Okay, Lou's as old as I am, so he remembers that, okay? Anybody? Okay, none of you young people, that's a Budweiser jingle, okay. All right, never bring up a 50-year-old jingle in a homily again. Okay, got that. Here comes the King. When Isaiah the prophet spoke those words, he told the people, make straight your paths, fill in every valley, let the hills be made low. And what he was doing, you know, when the king or the ruler would come through your village and your town, you had to run out there and smooth out your roads. You had to fill in the potholes. You had to crown off the hills because you didn't want your ruler, your king, to be jostled, his horse to stumble, or his carriage to hit a pothole, because that did not go well for your village after that. Might have some soldiers showing up the next day. So it was a very practical kind of recommendation to fill in the valleys, fill in the roads, make smooth the road for the king, is what Isaiah was saying. Now we want to make smooth the road for the king within our own hearts. We want to fill in those valleys within our lives. We want to smooth over those rough edges and welcome the king. And why Isaiah says to comfort my people. You know, we are awaiting the birth of our king. Not a king who comes to terrorize us, not a king that we should fear, but a king who comes to comfort his people. And this is a year when we need the Lord's comfort, isn't it? So this Advent, we are awaiting a king who loves us relentlessly and tenderly, who desires to comfort us. That's a beautiful thing. The second thing I see in these readings is that Jesus wants to meet us in our troubled world. We are so longing for that. You know, before before God incarnated himself into this world, for 400 years, the Jewish people, they had no kings. They had no prophets. They had no angels showing up. God was silent to the people of God for 400 years before the birth of Christ. And the people were longing for God to speak. They were longing to hear something from Yahweh. The Jewish people had been scattered. They were living in all sorts of different lands. The remnant that lived in Israel were under the occupation of the Romans. And they wanted the Messiah to come and free them. There had been revolutions and wars, and many of them bloodied. False messiahs had risen up and given the people a false hope and then threw them down. And then the religious leaders got so caught up and devolved their faith into the strictness of laws and practices that just made them fearful and took them farther and farther away from the heart of Yahweh. People were longing for something deeper. The Romans put up a puppet king, King Herod, who ruled over the people with cruelty and fierceness and intimidation. But then the angel Gabriel showed up in a little backwater village of Bethlehem to a young mother proclaiming good news, for a child had been born. A child born to an unwed mother in poverty who would quickly become a refugee, but a child who would grow in knowledge and wisdom, a child who 30 years later would see his cousin John, the crazy guy in the wilderness living on locusts and honey, proclaiming, "Prepare the way of the Lord." The incarnation of Jesus into our world tells us that God dwells with us in the midst of our troubles. People can feel in challenging years like this that God is distant and far away, and there is a longing for something deeper, and we have that in the incarnation of Jesus Christ. So this Advent, there is a longing for God to speak into our lives. The last thing I see in these readings is this idea of hope. You know, this reading from 2 Peter, it starts out about, the Lord, one day is like 1,000 years. And it reminds me of a time when a guy went to the Lord and said, "Lord, what is a million years like to you?" And God said, "Well, a million years is like a second." The man thought, and he said, "Okay, Lord, what's $1 million like to you?" And the Lord said, "Well, I think $1 million is like a penny." The man thought, he held out his hand, said, "Lord, can I have a penny?" And the Lord said, "Sure, just give me a second." Ba-da-boom. Many of these first century Christians that 2 Peter is written to, they were expecting the Messiah to return in their lifetime. Some of them even quit their jobs. Some of them abandoned their families because they thought for sure the Lord was returning. And the writer of 2 Peter is saying to the people, yes, God is returning. There is hope that Jesus is coming back, but he's coming back in his own time. And so the writer of 2 Peter says, I'm assuring you that God is coming back, but here's how you should live. Conduct yourselves with kindness and devotion, and be eager and found without spot or blemish before him, and be at peace. Now you got to remember, this was written, 2 Peter was written around the year 80 to 90. This is 10 years after the temple in Jerusalem had been destroyed by the Romans. The city of Jerusalem had been under siege, and thousands, hundreds of thousands of Jews had been killed. And what is the writer of St. Peter saying? In the midst of this troubles, in the midst of this time, you can still have hope. God is still working and moving. He is moving in this world, and yes, everything's going to dissolve away, the author says. Everything's going to dissolve. This pandemic is going to dissolve away. The pain and suffering we've all experienced and the loss, that's going to dissolve away. This world with all of its hardships is dissolving away. The disciples in this first century were speaking hope into people that needed hope, and that is what we need as well. We are an Advent people, and so too we are a hopeful people. Now, the early lighting of Christmas decorations told me that, people are looking for hope. They are longing for something that's meaningful in the midst of this, and they're waiting to hear those good words. They need that now more than ever. But will we, the church of the prophet Isaiah, will we, the church of John the Baptist, will we, the church of the apostle Peter, will we, the church of Jesus of Bethlehem, allow our neighbors only to see a manufactured, multicolored display of fake joy? No. People are waiting, and they are longing, and they are hoping for something significant that makes sense in the midst of this challenging year. And it all comes down to Jesus and understanding that God has not abandoned us. This world is dissolving away, but God is alive, and he is active, and he is present. And he is calling us, a people who understand this, to be his witnesses to our neighbors, to our family, to our co-workers, that there is hope. There is hope. God has not abandoned us and will be with us always. That is how we will be an Advent people.